Okay, I'm just gonna do a quick little video here where I'm just gonna read some books from Skyrim, and the first one I'm gonna start with is called The Wild Elves. Seems befitting for my elf hat here, so my homemade elf hat that is. But all right, we'll start with The Wild Elves. The Wild Elves by Joe Korvac. In the wilds of most every province of Tamriel, descended philosophically, if not directly, from the original inhabitants of the land, are the Aelids, commonly called the Wild Elves. While three races of elven stock, the Outmer, the Bosmer, and the Dunmer, have assimilated well into new cultures of Tamriel, the Aelids and their brethren have remained aloof towards our civilization, preferring to practice the old way far from the eyes of the world. The Wild Elves speak a variation of Old Cryodelic, opting to shun Tamrielic and separating themselves from the mainstream of Tamriel even further than the least urbanized of their elven cousins. In temperament, they are dark-spirited and taciturn, though this is from the point of view of outsiders, or Peleni in their tongue, and doubtless they act differently within their own tribes. Indeed, one of the finest sages of the University of Willem was a civilized Aelid elf, Tribur Fear, who published work on wild elves suggesting a lively, vibrant culture. Fear is one of the very few Aelids to speak freely on his people and religion, and he himself said, "The nature of Aelid's tribes is multi-hued, their personalities often wildly different from their neighboring tribes." Fear, Nature of Aelid's Posse, University Press. Like any alien culture, wild elves are often feared by the simple people of Tamriel. The Aelids continue to be one of the greatest enigmas of the content of Tamriel. They seldom appear in the pages of written history in any role, and then only as a strange sight a chronicler stumbles upon before they vanish into the wood. When probable fiction is filtered from common legend, we are left with almost nothing. The mysterious way of the Aelids have remained shrouded since before the First Era, and may well remain so for thousands of years to come. So, the next one we're going to read is Faefolken, Book 2. After giving to Taskin had demonstrated their knowledge of elementary conjuration, the great sage told them that they were free to enjoy the day. The two lads, who most afternoons fidgeted through their lessons, refused to leave their seats. "You told us that after the test you'd tell us more of your tale about the scribe and his enchanted quill," said Taxcon. "You already told us about the scribe, how he lived alone, and his battles with the temple secretary over the bulletin he scripted for posting, and how he suffered from the crimson plague and couldn't speak. When you left off, his messenger boy had his master's quill enchanted with the spirit of Daedra named Faefolken," added Vongeldak, to aid the great sage's memory. "As it happens, the great sage, I was thinking about a nap. However, the story does touch on some issues of the natures of spirits, and thus is related to conjuration, so I'll continue. Thabard began using the quill to write the temple bulletin, and there was something about the slightly lopsided, almost three-dimensional quality of the letters that Tharobed liked a lot. Into the night, Tharobed put together the Temple of Ariel's bulletin. For the moment, he washed over the page with the Faefolken quill. It became a work of art, an illuminated manuscript crafted of gold, but with good, simple, and strong vernacular. The sermon excerpts read like poetry, despite being based on the archpriest's workmanlike exhortation of the most banal of the Elysian doctrines. The obituaries of two of the temple's chief benefactors were stark and powerful, pitifully mundane deaths transitioned into world-class tragedies. Thoroughbad worked the magical palette until he nearly fainted from exhaustion. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a day before deadline, he handed the bulletin to Gorgos for him to carry to Alphurs, the temple secretary. As expected, Alphurs never wrote back to compliment him or even comment on how early he had sent the bulletin. It didn't matter. Thoroughbad knew it was the best bulletin the temple had ever posted. At 1 o'clock on Sundays, Gorgos brought him many messages. The bulletin today was so beautiful. When I read it in the vestibule, I am ashamed to tell you I wept copiously, wrote the archpriest. I don't think I've ever seen anything that captures Ariel's glory so beautifully before. The cathedrals of first hold pale in comparison. My friend, I prostrate myself before the great artist Saint Skyrim. The archpriest was like most men of the cloth, given to hyperbole. Still, Thoroughbad was happy with the compliment. More messages followed. All of the temple elders and 33 of the parishioners, young and old, had all taken the time to find who wrote the bulletin and how to get a message to congratulate him, and there was only one person that they could go through for that information, Eliphas. Imagining the dragon lady, besieged by his admirers, filled Thoroughbad with positive glee. He was still in a good mood. The next day he took the ferry to his appointment with his healer. Telemaco, the herbalist, was new, a pretty red-garbed woman who tried to talk to him even after he gave her the note reading, My name is Thoroughbad Holzik, and I have an appointment with Telemaco for 11 o'clock. Please forgive me for not talking, but I have no voice box anymore. Has it started raining yet? She asked cheerfully. The diviner said it might. Thoroughbad frowned and shook his head angrily. Why was it that everyone thought that mute people liked to be talked to? Did soldiers who lost their arms like to be thrown balls? It was undoubtedly not a purposeful cruel behavior, but Thoroughbad still suspected that some people just liked to prove that they weren't crippled too. The examination itself was routine horror. Telemaco performed the regular invasive torture, all the while chatting and chatting and chatting. You ought to try talking once in a while. That's the only way to see if you're getting better. If you don't feel comfortable doing it in public, you should try practicing it by yourself, said Telemaco, knowing her patient would ignore her advice. Try singing in the bath. You'll probably find you don't sound as bad as you think. Thoroughbad left the examination with the promise of test result in a couple of weeks. On the ferry ride back home, Thoroughbad began thinking of next week's temple bulletin. What about a double border around the last Sunday's offering plate announcement? Putting the sermon in 2 columns instead of 1 might have interesting effects. It was almost unbearable to think he couldn't get started on it until Eliphas sent information. When she did, it was a bulletin with the note, Last bulletin, a little better. Next time don't use the words fortuitous in place of fortunate. These words are not, if you look them up, synonymous. In response, Thoroughbad almost followed Telemaco's advice by screaming obscenities in Gorgos. Instead, he drank a bottle of cheap wine, composed, and sent a suitable reply and fell asleep on the floor. The next morning, after a long bath, Thoroughbad began working on the bulletin. His idea for putting a light shading effect on the special announcement section had an amazing textured effect. Eliphas always hated the extra decorations he added to the border, but using the Feyfolken quill, they looked strangely powerful and majestic. Gorgos came to him with a message from Eliphas at that very moment, as if response to the thought Thoroughbad opened it up. It simply said, I'm sorry. Thoroughbad kept working. Eliphas' note he put from his mind, sure that she would soon follow it with the complete message. I'm sorry that no one ever taught you to keep right hand and left hand margins the same length, or I'm sorry we can't get somewhere other than a weird old man as scribe of our bulletin. It didn't matter what she was sorry about. The columns from the sermon notes rose like the massive pillar of roses, crowned with unshameably ornate headers. The obituaries and birth announcers were framed together with a spherical border as a heartbreaking declaration of the circle of life. The bulletin was simultaneously both warm and avant-garde. It was a masterpiece. When he sent it off to Alifers late that afternoon, he knew she'd hate it, and was glad. Thoroughbed was surprised to get a message from the temple on Lordas. Before he read the content, he could tell from the style that it wasn't Alifers. The handwriting wasn't Alifers' usual belligerent slashing style, and it wasn't at all in Alifers' usual capital letters, which read like a scream from oblivion. Thoroughbred, I thought you should know Alifers isn't at the temple anymore. She quit her position yesterday, very suddenly. My name is Vanderthill, and I was lucky enough, let me admit it now, I beg pitifully, to be your new temple contact. I'm overwhelmed by your genius. I was having a crisis of faith until I read last week's bulletin. This week's bulletin is a miracle. Enough. I just wanted to say I am honored to be working with you. Vanderthill. The response on Sundays after the service even astonished Thoroughbed. The archpriest attributed the massive increase in attendance and collection plate offering entirely to the bulletin. Thoroughbed's salary was quadruple. Gorgos brought over 120 messages from his adoring public. The following week, Thoroughbed sat in front of his writing blank, a glass of fine Torvelli mead at his side, staring at the blank scroll. He had no ideas. The bulletin, his child, his second wife, bored him. The third-rate sermons of the archbishop were absolute anathema, and the deaths and births of the temple patron struck him as entirely pointless. Blah, blah, he thought as he scribbled on the page. He knew he wrote the letters blah, blah. The words that appeared on the scroll were a necklace of pearl on a white neck. He scrawled and jagged line across the page. It appeared, and through the damn beautiful Fayfolken quill. Glory to Ariel. Thoroughbed slammed the quill, and poetry spilled forth in a stream of ink. He scratched over the page, blotted over everything, and the vanquished words sprung back up in different form, and even more exquisite than before. Every daub and splatter caused the document to whirl like a kaleidoscope before falling together. In the gorgeous asymmetry, there was nothing he could do to ruin the bulletin. Fayfolken had taken over. He was a reader, not an author. Now, asked the great sage, what was Fayfolken from your knowledge of the school of conjuration? What happened next? Cried Vongeldak. First, tell me what Fayfolken was, and then I'll continue the story. You said it was a daedra, said Taxon, and it seems to have something to do with artistic expression. What Fayfolken, a servitor of Azora? But the scribe may have been imagining all this, said Vondak. Perhaps Fayfolken is a servitor of Shigarath, and he's gone mad, or the quill's writing makes everyone who views it, like all the congregation of the Temple of Ariel, go mad. Hermaeus Mora is the daedra of knowledge, and Hircine is the daedra of wild, and the daedra of revenge is Bothia, pondered Taxon. And then he smiled. Fayfolken is a servitor of Clavicus Vile, isn't it? Very good, said the great sage. How did you know? It's his style, said Taxon. Assuming that he doesn't want the power of the quill, now that he has it, what happens next? I'll tell you, said the great sage, and continued the tale. All right. That would be some books from Skyrim. So, peace out.